In my previous video, I broke down every single note of Stairway to Heaven's guitar solo using my complete tab of the song. Today I'm following up with a companion video where I'm going to show you on the guitar how to physically recreate each of these notes in order to reproduce the exact guitar solo from the original chording by Jimmy Page. Unlike other Stairway lessons, of which there are billions, I'm not going to be teaching you how to play the solo if you don't already know it. My goal is to go one level deeper, so for this lesson you have to already be comfortable playing Stairway. That way we can really hone in on the intricate details. For that reason, I'm not going to be displaying the tab on the screen, and I don't have a camera set up to show you exactly which fret on which string I'm playing. The visual aspect isn't really that important, and what I want you to do is to listen to the sound of each note and how I actually describe their characteristics. If you're trying to learn Stairway from scratch, you should watch the previous video and follow along with the tab itself. Once you've established the baseline on what notes to play, then you can follow along with this video and perfect the how aspect. In fact, I'm going to reference a few of the same points that I went through on that video, so if you haven't seen it at all, I do recommend watching it first to get a complete picture of the story, even if you already think that you know how to play Stairway to Heaven. So I'm going to start by playing you the solo from that instrumental reproduction in full, but this time there's going to be no backing track. It's just going to be the raw guitar footage. By the way, that took about like 50 takes over 3 hours to nail. So even though Stairway is something that we think of being as like an intermediate or even like an advanced beginner solo, like something that you should know how to play within the first 2 years, it's actually not that easy to nail because of all the minor intricate details that I'm going to be going over in this video. With that out of the way, the first thing we want to talk about is tone. Jimmy Page recorded this solo on a Telecaster, of which I do own one. It was my first electric guitar, but inconveniently it's not on me right now, so all I have is this Jackson to show off the principles. The Tele has two single coil pickups which produce drastically different tones. Without a Tele or single coils, the concept is still pretty similar. So your neck pickup is going to be warm and perfect for blues soloing, if I can get a clean tone on. Going to be most synonymous with Eric Clapton, whereas the bridge pickup is going to give you more of a brighter, twangy sound. Which was originally good for rockabilly and country, but with distortion is phenomenal for rock and roll, and that's what you're going to use regardless of which guitar you have. It's going to be bridge pickup and distortion. So on the amp, you're going to want to max out your treble, cut all the bass, and basically dial the mids until you get something as close as you can to the record. For distortion, you want it to be dirty but not fully maxed on the gain. If we compare the setting that I have right now for Stairway versus the one I use for black metal, that's going to be a lot more compressed and modern. So I think the appropriate word that we want to use for the Stairway tone is crunchy. For reverb, you're going to want a little bit of an echo, but you don't want it to be fully washed out either. It should fade pretty quickly. The closer we can get to like a classic plate reverb where they literally put a metal plate in front of their amps, the better. You know, that quick fade out. The farther away we can get from that 80s arena saturation, that also the better. So at the end of the day, I'm not trying to actually remake Page's setup. That would be very difficult and probably very expensive as well. As long as we get something close enough, that's really all that matters. So like with the last video, I want to spend quite a bit of time on the first note. It's the most important note of the song, and really pick this one apart with a microscope. The first thing we need to talk about is bending. There are three ways you can approach a standard bend. You can do a fast bend that hits an instantaneous peak. You can do a slow, drawn-out bend that hits the top at the very end of the note. Right? For Stairway, you want to Goldilocks it and hit it just right. There should be some momentum going into that bend. But you also do want to arrive at the peak earlier rather than late, because we need time over the rest of the note to hit the next component. When Page gets to the top of this bend, he adds a pretty quick vibrato. Like bends, there are multiple ways to do it. There are fast vibratos, and then there are slow vibratos. And you can also play vibratos with your fingers or with your arm. For slow vibratos, you're going to want to use your fingers because they give you fine control over the details. If you do a slow vibrato with your arm, it's going to look something like this. I'm basically throwing the neck back and forth in my hand. It's not very efficient. Conversely, on a fast vibrato, you don't want to use your fingers. It's a lot of work on the wrist to shake back and forth like that. Instead, what you can do is utilize your forearm. Basically seize up your muscles, your bicep and your forearm, and get that vibration. Since Page uses a fast vibrato, you're going to want to use your arm here. So far, we start with the Goldilocks bend, go into that arm vibrato, and the last component of this note happens at the very end with a slight release. We're not releasing all the way. That's too much. So this is kind of a subtle halfway release. That's more of just a natural relaxation of the hand as we prepare to shift in the pentatonic run. I wouldn't even say it's intentional. It's just part of the standard bending technique. You bend, vibrato, and at the end, you're gonna just let it go a little bit, kind of like a quarter bend release before you go into that pentatonic run. The first two components are easy to master because they're very standard. This piece at the end is actually pretty tough. It requires a lot of practice to get the sound to be just right. But it's really critical to incorporate because it's way more subtle than the other effects and it's easy to miss. But it's essential if you're trying to get that perfect Stairway sound. So the next component is going to be that pentatonic run, which ends with a pair of pull-offs and another vibrato. I gave my justifications for the picking pattern in the tab breakdown, but in short, the best way to play this is to pick the opening pentatonic pairs that are on different strings. And then when you do the string jump and the paired notes are now on the same string, you want to do pull-offs. So you're going to end on that F with a nice little vibrato there. So this is a straightforward lick. We need much less time here to explain than the very first note. The next section, however, is more nuanced, not because it's particularly difficult, but because it's very often played incorrectly. My goal here is to show you how to play the solo note for note exactly the same way Jimmy Page played on the record. So the details, as minor as they might seem, are actually really important. The big mix-up here is how people choose to represent the legato elements. Do you slide? Do you hammer on? Or do you bend? Sometimes it's difficult to hear the difference. At my level, I can do it. It just takes some training. But for this section, there's only one way that actually makes logical sense. And it goes like this. The first two notes have to be played as bends. And the reason, the evidence for this is because of this next specific note right here. You play A on the first string, and then slide to the same A on the second string. So the only way you can be in the right position is to start the lick in the 5th fret position and play bends. If you start with the slide, you're way out of position. Hammer-ons, it's the same thing. So then people start to do other substitutes, like instead of playing this slide, they'll play it like this. The proper technique that Jimmy Page used when he recorded the solo was to bend and then slide. The other common mistake is playing an E instead of an F at the end. If you're playing the pentatonic E, unfortunately, you're doing it wrong. The song is in A minor, and this lick is over the F major chord, and the proper note to finish off the section is an F. These constitute the two most common mistakes with Stairway covers and tabs, mixing up the wrong legato elements and playing pentatonic E's instead of A minor scale F's. The reason I'm honing in on these common mistakes so much is if you want to learn how to play something right, it's also good to see how you can play it wrong. If I'm only showing you how to play it one way, you might miss if you're actually playing differently, because to the ear it sounds very similar, so you really have to focus on what I'm doing with my hands. For fun, I want to play this exact same lick the most incorrect way possible. So I'm doing a slide here, a hammer-on instead of the two bends, and then I'm doing bends here instead of slides, playing that E. Of all the covers I watched, I'm sure I've seen one where they played it exactly like this. Technically, all of the notes are exactly the same. On sheet music, not tablature, sheet music, they would be written without the details of the legato, so you would have to figure out how to play it yourself. On tablature, we get the luxury of showing how to do it right, and there's only one way that matches the motion of Jimmy Page's hands when he recorded the solo. So the next lick is a pair of pentatonic runs that are similar to the one at the beginning. So you're going to bend into pentatonics, hop to the pull-offs. That's all pentatonics there. The next note is somewhat disputed. To play this G, people sometimes incorporate things like slide outs. Or like something like a pull-off. To me, it just sounds like Jimmy Page is picking the open string. And that gives you time to move your fingers while you're playing that open and get in place for the next pentatonic. Sometimes I've seen other tabs tell you to play, instead of the open string, they tell you to play the fretted 5th. Which not only requires you to jump down, but then makes it even more difficult to jump up to the top to play the next pentatonic. So there's only one thing that makes sense in this context, which is to just play that open string. So at the very end, you're going to end on the F and slide up to the next section. But before we move there, I actually want to double back and hone in on another incredibly subtle addition that Page puts on this run. As Page starts the pentatonics and he hits the E and the C, that E and C, if you listen very carefully, you can hear really slight quarter bends. Did you catch that? It's really hard to hear, but it is actually there. And the technique to playing it is actually way more difficult than you might think. So these are not those kind of blues bends that you want to do like. Like, you don't want to throw in these blues bends, these kind of Buddy Guy type bends. It's really more of a slight deviation in pitch that you get when you fret a note really hard, right? Like this. Or when you're playing really fast and just putting a tiny little bit of extra pressure on your index finger as you're jumping from one string to the next. This is really tough to nail in real time, and this was actually one of the hardest things to hit in my cover. Sometimes I would bend too early and too much, and then it becomes obvious, or I'm just going too fast and I completely miss it. So when I try to hit this, what I do is I just do a slight pull of the hand, a tiny little just jerk of the finger. I don't know if you can really hear that, but it's there. In reality, it's probably not even intentional. Page probably just fretted really hard. He just happened to, be pushing real hard on his fingers. But it is really consistent because it happens twice on the same two notes in the same two sections back to back. And it only happens during this part of the solo. So I don't really know what to say about it. It's just something that you're gonna have to work really hard on to master. You wanna do those slight bends so that you can actually hear them, but you don't wanna overdo it. You don't wanna make it obvious. I think the easiest way to get this is if you have scalloped frets, and all you have to do is put a little bit of extra downward pressure as you fret these strings. So all right, now the next part. We end with our pinky on the F. So I'm gonna break this up into two halves and just talk about this first part. It's not totally difficult, but there are some minor technical parts that I've seen played inconsistently. So first you're gonna slide up, do a bar, and then a pull off. Now once you're here, the key piece is a shift slide. So you wanna play the D, and then slide up as separate eighth notes. What you don't want to do is a straight slide like the one at the beginning. You want to make sure that D is actually picked and held as that eighth note. So for the remainder section, the first thing is after the shift slide, you don't want to stay in 12th position, because that's going to require you to play the rest with your pinky. And it's gonna make this part really awkward, right? Not fun. So what you're gonna wanna do is bump your index up to the 13. And that's gonna make life easier. Now I'm gonna spend a little bit of time to talk about the bends in this section. They are a little bit weird. So they are not legato bend and releases. You don't want to do that. So don't legato. They're always separate notes that are going to be picked. But the technique is not as straightforward as it's going to seem at first, like with many of the techniques in the song. So the very first bend requires a slight pause in between the bend and the release. But it's not a hard staccato like this. Also, the picking of the second of the release note is also a little bit more complicated. What you're not going to do is you're not going to bend up and then pick from the top. What you actually want to do is pick the note as you're releasing. And this is the technique that I'm going to show you that I use to play this correctly. So when I bend this note up, I let it ring a little bit, right? So it's going to be a momentum bend. But then once I get to that dotted 16th note, which is how I tab this, I'm gonna bring my pick to touch the string and mute it for that 30-second note rest. It's really minor, but it sounds a little bit like this, right? Instead of a staccato, which is gonna sound like this, you're gonna get something that sounds like this. It's really hard to hear the difference, but there is a slight difference. Now for the release, the technique I'm going to use is instead of picking the note downright when I'm at the top, what I like to do is I'm going to bend the string up, mute it with my pick, Then I'm going to release the string into my pick. That way I hit the note on the way down as opposed to on the top of the bend. I'm going to use a similar technique on the other two bends in the section, except these bends don't have pauses. Is this how Jimmy Page wrote the song? Probably not. It's how he happened to play it. In reality, if I'm going to write this out on paper, I don't think I'm putting in the pause there. I think it would sound like this. But it just so happens on the studio recording that Page muted that first bend slightly. And that's why you don't hear a pause on the other two bends. You just hear that bend, and then the drop down pick on the release, which is the more important technique to master here. So just to play that whole thing again and get us back on track. So following the first bend, make sure you hit 2 C's there. That was actually one of the mistakes that I caught in my first version of the tab. Not the one that I released, but in the first draft before I went back to review, I only had a single C. When in fact he hits the C twice. So following that part, again, the bends are the same, but this is another area where we have common mistakes. There's a billion ways to play this wrong, and most of them involve picking this E on the first fret 12th string. So that's the first error, playing the E instead of an F, when you should be playing . So the second error is when people do play the F, but they don't play the E correctly. Again, they pick the E on the 12th fret. The correct note is the E, but you want to bend up from the 15th fret. And this is another place where you can, use any combination of hammer-ons and pull-offs, right? The right way to do it is to bend. The next part is going to be the easiest for this video because nobody plays this wrong. It goes like this. It's physically impossible to mess up except for that last note. At the very end of the run, you need to hit that bend instantaneously. Some people, when they play this, they introduce a slight pause, which is more of a blues thing again. Which is not correct to the album. You're gonna go right into the bend. So regarding this bend, it's the same exact technique he uses on the first note of the solo. So it's your Goldilocks perfect bend with that momentum, vibrato, and then a slight release at the end. It's kind of like a horse neighing. And that's why I spent so much time describing it, why you should work on perfecting this technique, because it does come up more than once in the solo. It must just be the way that Jimmy Page played his bends, during this time period. So the rest of the part after that is just going to be very straightforward pentatonics. I pick every single note here. It doesn't sound to me like there are any hammer-ons and pull-offs, so you might see someone play it like this. I don't hear it, so I just pick all the notes. The only legato being this bend. And I don't think that you hold the two notes together. So what Jimmy Page must be doing is that when he bends up, he mutes that bend, kind of with his thumb, and then just play. Because otherwise you would hear kind of this double stop sound, right? And I don't know that it's there. Oh, and when you get to that last note, you're going to want to put a really hard vibrato on it. So let me just play that whole thing again. So the next part is one that I find frustrating because I initially learned it in the wrong position. I stayed in the 12th position and I played it like this. So the issue on the actual recording, these three notes are held together. They're all held together, so you can't do that with two strings. The actual proper way to play this is going to be up on the 17th fret. So what you want to do is you want to bar the 17th, the first two strings, bend up with your ring finger, and then hold with your pinky. It's not easy to do for me, and it sounds bad because I have a Floyd Rose. And what happens when you bend a string, it flattens the other strings, and that's why this is actually a really tough section for me to play on this guitar, and I wish I had a Telecaster without a Floyd Rose. But that's a story for a different time. So after that little piece right there, you're gonna have a bend, release, and a pull off. And on this last bend, you're gonna put a really hard vibrato on it. So we're almost at the end. After that, we have the 1.5 step bends on A. So here, you're gonna play this. So at this point in your muscle memory, you're gonna want to vibrato every long note and every bend. But there's no vibrato on the first one. On the next few notes, you're going to use a bit of staccato. So the first bend is staccato, the release is staccato, and then you're going to play staccatoing the fourth note. After this, you're going to jump down to G and bend that into an A with a very hard vibrato. So I do the A bends with my ring finger, as I do most bends, but for efficiency, I switch to my middle finger for the G bend, because if you're doing this, and then you want to stay with your ring finger, you're going to have to do a slide back down. So I find it easier to just do this. So the last section is another very frustrating one because I initially learned it wrong, but this one is even worse than before. Most Stairway tabs and covers generally get the pitches right. They're just played with the wrong technique. The second to last line, however, is the one that I've seen where the whole thing is blatantly wrong. It doesn't sound anything like the actual solo. The correct way to play it is here. So a double whole step bend. Then you're gonna release it and finish pentatonics with your middle and pinky. Originally, when I was making this video, what I wanted to do was pull up some other tabs and then just read out and play this section for you and how they tab it out. But the result was so disastrous. I'm actually thinking of doing another video where I just review tabs and talk about what the issues are. Just know that any tab that's asking you to play this down in the 5th position is wrong. So if you see this, now, it sounds the same, right? The pitches are correct. So how do I know that this is the wrong way to play it and this is the right way to play it? Because playing down here is just simply put dumb. The way string tension works, the closer you are to the center of the string, the more slack you're gonna get. So it's the easier it's gonna be to bend it. Whereas if I try to bend that much up here, I might break the string, so I'm not gonna do that because I have a Floyd Rose and it's a pain in the ass to change strings. So just the closer you get to the nut, the tighter the string is going to be, just because of physics. Playing a double whole step bend down here is poor form. It's very difficult, especially when there's a better alternative. Especially since the last part is going to be up here, right? So if you're playing it here, that's just less distance to travel. If you're playing down here on the 5th fret, you're going to have to jump a whole octave just to play the final piece. As I've been working on these tabs and making all these videos, I've always wondered why. Why are there so many inconsistencies between tabs for something that's honestly not that difficult? And there are a few reasons. Some of them are very good in that tabbing is for the most part a hobby, and people that are doing it, they're not gonna spend 3 months listening to the song over and over again to try and get every single note right. You know, that's reserved for the most obsessed maniacs in the world, like me. Most people learn how to play a song, they learn it by ear, and it sounds good enough to them. So they just try and put what they've learned on paper. One of the big issues, I think, with Stairway, and one of the realizations I had, is that there's a percentage of guitarists that never use their pinky, and they avoid using it at all costs. So when they learn how to play songs, they do everything with the stretch of the ring finger. That makes some of the passages in Stairway harder or even impossible to play. So some people that aren't able to use their pinky will figure out alternative ways, and this is probably the main reason a lot of tabs have issues. For example, this lick. The most efficient way to play this is to use your pinky to bend the first string, and then slide up with your pinky. So if you never use your pinky, it's going to be really difficult to play with your middle finger. You can do it, but one of these guitarists is going to be inclined to find a different technique. Avoiding the pinky at all costs. Another lick is this one, right? Right? You're gonna play it on the first two strings. Because you're not gonna wanna use your pinky to play this triple stop. So if you're not studying the tab intently and listening to it note for note, you don't hear that all three notes are held together, you're gonna be fine playing this. And then lastly, the reason that you're going to want to play this section that I went over here down in 5th position is and look at that, my Floyd Rose has been thrown out of tuning. This is why I wish I had my Telecaster sometimes. Alright, so we're close enough. Anyway, the point is, avoiding the pinky simply forces you to make adjustments that are most of the time going to be less efficient and ultimately not match the way that Jimmy Page, a pinky user, recorded the solo on Led Zeppelin IV. As far as nuances go for this section, the very first bend is the only thing that's actually interesting. When I started tabbing this song, I wrote it as a 1.5 bend from 11. But ultimately, I noticed that was wrong, and the bend does start from a lower note. And in fact, it's not really the start that got me, it's the end that made me realize this, because I, heard it starting from around 11. But the releases all the way down to 10. Because the 11 is completely chromatic. And so what I think is going on here is that Page doesn't start picking the note until he's already bent up. So he's like halfway to 11, as opposed to, right? So he's already going up. And one of the funny things is, again, the first version of the tab that I learned, when I was 14, had the section played here, and it had the bend on the 7, kind of like a Dorian mode, which is the 11th fret, by the way. So it would have been 1.5 bend from here. And probably one of the reasons is it's so much harder to bend double whole step. So again, the compromise of not wanting to use the pinky and wanting to keep everything with the ring finger was to tab the bend as a 1.5 from here, instead of playing it up here, where it's much easier to do the bend, but requires you to throw your pinky back and forth. And one final thing is the very last note of the section. It's one of those places where you're gonna feel like throwing in a vibrato, but for some reason Page doesn't really put a strong one here, and I think the right way to do it is just hold the note. Maybe a little bit of wiggle. but not one of those extreme vibratos from before. Like, you don't want to close the solo out on one of those. And that's it. I'm done. That's Stairway to Heaven. I know there's one more lick, but there's literally nothing for me to talk about here because nobody ever plays this wrong. There's only one way you can possibly do it. 100% of covers and tabs get this right. So I'm just going to give it to you. And there it is. This is how you can recreate every single note of Jimmy Page's guitar solo from the studio recording of Stairway to Heaven. So for all of you who've always wanted to play it note for note perfectly, this video is going to get you there. To close the books, let me just hit it for you one more time. This might be the last time I play Stairway to Heaven for a very, very, very long time. Take 3. Take 4. I missed a note. Take 5. Not clean. Fingers sweaty. Take 6. Take 7. Take 8. Take 9. So 9 takes to get it right, even though I've played this solo billions of times by now. A few things that I kept messing up. The very first bend, I'm really picky about it just because it's really easy. It's like people who speedrun video games, they'll like reset 10 seconds in because of a stupid little mistake. That doesn't cost time, but it's just something that, you know, I can always do better. Another thing, on a few runs, I noticed that I was forgetting to put those bends on the pentatonics, which again was pretty tough, but I did put them on the last one. I think I messed up a little up here. I didn't put the pause in that bend, right? So I just went continuous into it. It's just one of those things that are easy to forget. And I'm sure you saw me prepare for this triple bend section here by like getting into a weird position. It's just really the nature of the Floyd Rose. When you bend and flatten the strings, I have to like pre-bend this bar to keep things in the same pitch. It was awful on the actual recording for my cover. It was bad. So yeah, a solo that I've supposedly known how to play for 15 years, that I've been playing over and over and over again for 15 years, still have trouble with it to this day. So the next time somebody tells you that, oh, Stairway solo is really easy, point them to this video, not just to give you more views, but to really show them that this is not as easy as you think it is. There's very, very many tiny nuances if you're trying to nail this. I'm talking 100% accurate to the recording on Led Zeppelin IV. There's really a lot of tiny, minute details that you need to go in and practice, but I've revealed them all for you today, so I hope you have a lot of fun working on this and getting it to sound right. While part of me does feel like it's time to move on and talk about the rest of the instruments from Stairway, which I think there are much more interesting sections like the drums, the keys, and the bass, I don't think I'm quite done with the solo yet, and there's still a few other ideas I want to explore. First off, I don't think I've quite given enough evidence actually that my version of the solo is the most perfect one other than me telling you that it is. So next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut up my version of the instrumental reproduction and play it section by section along with the original as proof that both solos do sound exactly the same. So I don't think that I can truly call myself a rightful authority on Stairway until I actually provide this kind of evidence and show that I know what I'm talking about. After that, I think it'll be really fun if I pull up some tabs and covers and go about rating them, explain what they've done right and what they've done wrong. Not as a means of boasting or showing off. I mean, not all covers need to be perfect because not all covers aim to be perfect. People are just trying to recreate the sound, right? This is really an exceptional exercise, what I'm trying to do by making each note 100% accurate to the recording. But I think doing that kind of exercise is going to be a fun way to kind of critique and analyze tabbing as an art form, and also talk about ear training when it comes to identifying differences in how the same exact notes can be played.